today we're going to be doing a valve adjustment on a 1994 CBR900RR. Now these motorcycles, like a lot of other sport bikes, use a shim-under-bucket style valve train system. And to do an adjustment on a valve system like this is a lot more involved than the turn screw style rocker arm type system that other motorcycles use. But typically shim-under-bucket style valve train systems are used on high RPM engines such as the CBR that revs up to 11,000 RPM. Now, while the intervals are manufacturer specific, a valve check should be done right around 12 to 15,000 miles on most motorcycles. So the bike we have back here, again, is a 94 CBR, and of course I bought it used, and the bike didn't come with any maintenance records. It's overall in good shape, but without any maintenance records, there's no way to know when the valves were last checked. This bike has 41,000 miles, so it's way overdue for any sort of valve check and adjustment. We're gonna go in here and start stripping the bike down to get to the engine and see what the valves check out at. Let's get to it. The next step involves releasing the tension from the cam chain tensioner right here. The Honda factory service manual says make up a tool that looks kind of like this key, and I've just used 20 gauge sheet metal, and it's about 1 millimeter thick. And of course the dimensions to make this tool are in the service manual. What you're supposed to do is plug this into the tensioner right. You have to find the slot. So now it's in the slot. And you're supposed to twist it clockwise to relieve the tension. So it's got like a spring-loaded tensioner in here. But right there, I've wound it up all the way, and then it slots into one of the little holders, the little notches in the body of the cam chain tensioner, and it just holds it in place like that. So now the tension's off the timing chain, so now we should be able to rotate the engine freely, and not only that, but should be able to lift the camshafts out of their place with sprockets attached, since there's now slack in the chain. The next thing I'm going to do is remove the valve cover and then pull out the spark plugs. So next thing we've got to do is remove this crankshaft alignment cap. So when this is off, there'll be alignment timing marks so that we can measure each point where we need to take a measurement for the valves. Okay, with the cap off, we can see the end of the crankshaft, and we can see some markings on the inside of there. There are two letters, T and F, and there's two alignment marks inside of those two letters. And what we have to do is get that T alignment mark to line up with this little notch here in the casing. We need to rotate the engine here with the ratchet. Once we get that T aligned up here, we have to go look up at top of the engine at the camshafts and make sure they're aligning with their marks on the cylinder head, because you have to remember the crankshaft rotates twice for every time that the camshaft rotates. So technically we could line this T up and those camshafts will not have aligned with their marks on the cylinder head. So we'll have to rotate this once, check this camshafts, and if they line up, then we're good, but if they haven't lined up, we need to rotate it once again and come back to that T alignment mark and check our camshafts again, and everything should be lined up. Now, I have removed the spark plugs from the engine, so being able to turn the engine over is pretty easy. You can just do it with a 1/2-inch ratchet. Okay, so we've just aligned that with a T, so let's go look at the marks on the camshaft. This is our exhaust camshaft, and we're really supposed to be seeing, according to the service manual, an EX stamping here, inferring that that is the exhaust alignment marker, and you can see we're almost 180 degrees off from that. So right here we've got an IN alignment marker, and it's not even lined up with the cylinder head. So we know we're 180 degrees out from our first valve measurement. So now we've got to rotate the crankshaft another complete revolution, 360 degrees, in order for our camshafts to be aligned correctly for our first measurement. Okay, so if we check our camshaft alignment again, we can see that we have this EX alignment with the cylinder head here, and you can't see it, but the other sprocket has an IN stamping alignment that is now aligned with the cylinder head flat part as well. So we know that we are now currently in the correct position to take our first measurement, which is the intake valves on cylinder 1 and 3. So cylinder 1 is the leftmost cylinder, and cylinder 3 is the second from the right cylinder. So there are 4 valves in total we need to check, and we're looking for the same measurement across all 4 valves. So something to remember anytime you're doing a valve adjustment on any engine, you want to make sure the engine is completely cold. One way to guarantee the engine is completely cold is just let it sit overnight. On this particular bike, the correct valve gap measurement on the intake valves is 0.006 of an inch, so pretty small gap. And to take those measurements, you use a feeler gauge like this. And I just want to see if this slides underneath the camshaft lobe and between the bucket and the camshaft lobe. So that one is okay. Now we're going to move on to this. Now what you're looking for is not only for it to slide underneath, but for it to have just the slightest bit of resistance. You don't want to have to force it under there. You just want to make sure it just has a little bit of drag, but not too much. So what I'm going to do is, to make sure this is actually the correct measurement, I'm going to take out the 0.007 of an inch feeler gauge, which is the next step up on the feeler gauge scale. So I'm going to try to stick the 0.007 in there. And if I can't get that to slide in, which I can't on that one, and I can't get it to slide in on there, so we know that the gap isn't too large. It is actually just perfect on that cylinder 1. So we can move on to cylinder 3 now. Fits nicely. That fits nicely there as well. So again, we'll pull up the 0.007 and see if we can slide this in there. Okay, so this third cylinder measures perfectly as well. All right, so now we'll rotate the crankshaft 180 degrees. Now this one's a little bit harder to line up just because all we're going to be doing is taking this hash mark down here, and we want to rotate it so that it is pointed perpendicular straight upward. That'll indicate that it's 180 degrees turned. That mark is now pointed directly upward. Now looking at the camshafts, you don't get any sort of indication that those are lined up. You just kind of have to use this as a rough guess. So there's the camshaft, and you can see the only indication is this intake marking, and it's pointed kind of perpendicular. So now that the crankshaft is in this position, we'll now measure the exhaust valves on cylinder 2 and 4. So cylinder 2 is the second from the left, and cylinder 4 is the furthest most to the right. So the one that's right over here. So the measurements for these exhaust clearances are 0.009 inches or 0.009 of an inch. Okay, so now we're going to measure the exhaust valves, which are this camshaft, the forwardmost camshaft. I pulled out the 0.009 of an inch feeler gauge, and it actually won't go through there. Let's try this one. And it won't go through that one either. So this cylinder 2's exhaust valve gap is too small. So now we work our way down the feeler gauge set and find one that will fit in there. That'll give us our current measurement, which we will use to subtract from the preferred measurement, and that will be how we determine which size shim we put back in there. Let's go down to 0.008. Stick this in there. And 0.008 doesn't fit either. So the service manual gives you leeway of 1/1000th of an inch. So right now we are definitely out of spec on cylinder 2 exhaust valves. So let's keep going down the range here and see if we can find one that does fit in there. So the next one down is 7/1000ths of an inch. So 7/1000ths of an inch does fit in there. 7/1000ths of an inch does not fit on that one. Okay, so this one measures at 7/1000ths of an inch, so I'm gonna write that down so I don't forget. And then I'm gonna pull out a 6/1000th of an inch feeler gauge and see if I can slide it into the rightmost exhaust valve on cylinder 2. Okay, so 6/1000ths of an inch does slide in there. So that one measures 6/1000ths of an inch. Okay, so now we're gonna move down to cylinder 4. Again, we'll pull out our 9/1000ths of an inch feeler gauge. See if we can slide it in there on either one of these. So no, we can't. Okay, no, we can't. All right, so these are already looking like they're gonna be out of spec as well. Okay, so 8/1000ths of an inch does slide into that one on the leftmost on cylinder 4. Does it fit on the rightmost? Drop down to 7/1000ths of an inch. Okay, 7/1000th of an inch doesn't fit in there. Okay, so 6/1000th of an inch doesn't even fit in there. Okay, so we'll drop down to 5/1000ths of an inch. Okay, so 5/1000ths of an inch does fit in there. So that one was significantly smaller. Okay, so we know we're gonna be pulling out the exhaust camshaft already just based on those two cylinders measurements. We're gonna rotate the crankshaft again so we can get the measurements on the next set of intake valves, which are cylinders 2 and 4. Okay, so we're gonna rotate this again, which means we want the T alignment mark to align with the casing indentation. There we go. Okay, so this is what our camshaft sprocket looks like. So our exhaust marking is lined up with the cylinder head, so that gives you an indication that you're in the right spot. So in this position, we're going to be measuring the intake valves for cylinders 2 and 4. Okay, so we'll pull out our 6/1000th feeler gauge. All right, so that slides in there nicely on number 2, and the other one on number 2 slides in nicely. So we'll go up a size to 7/1000ths. All right, so this is 7/1000ths. 7/1000ths won't slide into there, and 7/1000ths won't slide into there. Cylinder 2 intake valves are in perfect shape. Now let's move down to cylinder 4. So 6/1000ths doesn't fit in that gap, and it doesn't fit in that one either. So cylinder 4 appears to be a bit tight. We'll pop down to 5/1000ths and see if that will go in. Okay, so 5/1000ths fits in the leftmost valve on cylinder 4 and on the rightmost valve on cylinder 4. So technically that's within 1/1000th. So that's technically within spec. So I'll write that down and maybe I'll go ahead and adjust it anyways. So that is all of our intake valves completely measured. So now we've got to rotate the crankshaft 180 degrees again. So we'll be looking for this little notch to be perpendicular, pointing upwards. So looking at the camshaft sprockets, our indication that we're in the right spot is this EX marking with the slot pointing perpendicular upwards from the flat portion of the cylinder head. So in this, we're going to be doing the exhaust valve measurements on cylinder 1 and 3. So our exhaust valve measurement should be 9/1000ths of an inch. So that's the one I have selected on the feeler gauge. Cylinder 1 is a no. The other one on cylinder 1 is a no at 9/1000ths. So let's slip down to 8. Okay, so 8/1000ths goes in. 8/1000ths is a no on that. Okay, so the rightmost valve, let's slip down to 7/1000ths of an inch. This means we are now getting out of the range of what the factory service manual says is acceptable. So 7/1000ths does not fit. Let's see if 6/1000ths of an inch fits. Okay, so 6/1000ths is our measurement on that one. Now on to cylinder 3. We'll go back up to 9/1000ths of an inch. That's a no on that one. That's a no on that one. Okay, we'll try 8/1000ths of an inch. Okay, so that one is 8/1000ths, so that one does work. So try 8/1000ths of an inch on the right side valve, and that's a no. 7/1000ths of an inch is a no. Okay, so this one measures at 6/1000ths of an inch. All right, so that's all the valves measured. Obviously, we've got some that are out of spec, mainly on the exhaust side. Now we've got to rotate the crankshaft again 180 degrees to get this lined up and the camshafts lined up. Once we've done that, we have to pull the camshafts out and then pull the buckets out for each individual valve and measure the shims within. So now our crankshaft alignment mark is lined up with the casing marking. And if we look at our camshafts, we can see that EX marking is lined up here with the flat part of the cylinder head. You can't see it on camera, but the other camshaft is lined up as well with a similar marking. So now we know when we pull these camshafts out, we know how to put them back in by just making sure these are lined up. Okay, so let's take the camshafts out. Camshafts out of the way, it's now time to look at our measurement spreadsheet to figure out which valve buckets we need to take out and measure the shims on. Looking at our measurement sheet here, I've actually gone through and highlighted the individual valves that are way out of spec that definitely need to be adjusted, and it's all on the exhaust side. So out of the 8 exhaust valves, we've got 6 that need changed, and they're off by quite a bit. So knowing this, let's go ahead and attack the exhaust valves by using a magnet to pull out the buckets and also the shims. We'll start off with this cylinder 1 right side valve. So I've got this handy magnet telescoping stick type thing. It should be powerful enough to pick up the bucket. So the bucket is right here. Oh, there we go. Okay, so there's the bucket. You can see right on top is the shim, but let's go set the bucket down. I'm doing these one at a time so I don't get them mixed up because these buckets have worn into the camshaft and they're placed in the cylinder head. So we want to make sure everything we take out goes right back to the same spot. Let's pull out the shim now. You want to be very careful when pulling these shims out. You don't want to accidentally drop it down into an oil passage in the cylinder head. That would be really bad. So there we have it. There's our shim taken out, and you can see the shim rests on top of the valve stem itself. There's our shim and bucket for that first valve. And we're going to go ahead and measure the shim, and I've got a digital caliper. It's able to measure to the hundredths of a millimeter, and it looks like that's a 2.02 millimeter shim. And actually, if we look at this, you can see it's stamped with 202, so I assume that means it is a 2.02 millimeter shim. Okay, so now that we have that first shim measurement, we can write that down. You'll remember I did all my measurements in thousandths of an inch, but the shim kit that I have here, which is made by Pro X, is actually in millimeters. So I've had to go through here and convert all my measurements to millimeters, which is not a big deal. The feeler gauges actually have the conversion directly on there, so I've just written the millimeter measurements on top. So our millimeter measurement is 0.152 for that valve, and the factory service manual spec for that valve should be 0.22. So that means we've got a difference of almost 7/100ths of a millimeter. So what we want to do is take the factory specification minus the actual reading. So that would be 0.22 minus 0.152, which gives us a difference of 0.068 millimeters. And then we want to subtract this from the shim size. So we go 2.02, which is the shim size, minus .068, and that gives us 1.952. So what we've done here is actually figure out the size of our new shim, or get us close to a new shim size. Now we want to make that gap larger, which means we want to make this shim thinner, because if we make that thinner, that means this bucket sits lower, giving us that gap between the bucket and the camshaft lobe. So we've just calculated 1.952 as our new shim size. So this shim kit gives us sizes from 1.20 to 3.50 millimeters, so it should cover all of the range we need. So if we open this up, we'll see if we have something close to 1.952. There's all these shims in here, and on the back side are inscribed the sizes, and including on the back side of the case. And these have been coated with some sort of oil, and they've kind of stuck to the plastic case, so I've got to break them loose a little bit. Here's our 1.95 shim. You can see it says 1.95. So there we are. Based on our calculations, this is the shim that we should put back on top of the valve, and then put the bucket back in there. So let's put this on top of the valve. And there we are. That's one valve down. Now we've got to do the other 5 there on the exhaust side. For the rest of these, I won't do the calculations in real time. I'll just speed right through them with a time lapse, because we just want to get this done. Let's get to it. All right, so that's all the valves adjusted. I actually went in and changed some shims on the cylinder 4 intake valves because they were right on the edge of what's acceptable. I was able to add shims that increased the gap by 0.05 of a millimeter, so that got it way closer to the range it should have been in. So now what I need to do is clean up the sealing edge of the cylinder head so that I can apply new sealant to that gasket so that it'll seal and we don't have any oil leaks. And then once that's done, we'll put the camshafts back in and get the sprockets lined up with the chain over there, and then we can just bolt everything back down. Before we can stick the camshafts back in there, we have to put some assembly lube inside of the camshaft bearing journals here so that we don't get any sort of scoring when we start this engine back up. Okay, with the camshafts now back into the cylinder head, let me go down and talk about something that I'm really glad I did before I started taking everything apart. So if we look down here, we can see I've made a little mark on the timing chain roller pin that lines up with the EX / mark there on the exhaust cam sprocket. And then I also did the same thing with the intake cam sprocket as well. There's also an indentation in the sprocket, and I put a little marker on the roller pin of the timing chain. And I say I'm really glad I did that is because otherwise you wouldn't really know which link of the chain should be lining up with the indentation mark on the sprocket itself. And that's the importance of putting a little notch on the timing chain itself before you take it out. So I'm glad I did that, otherwise I'd be kind of fiddling back and forth trying to get these sprockets to line up just right. Now that we have the chain on properly and we've got the camshafts tightened down in their brackets, we have to rotate the engine 2 revolutions so that we get all the slack taken out of the timing chain. And then once that's done, we're gonna take our valve gap measurements on every valve again, just to make sure everything's good to go before we put this all back together. Okay, so I just rotated the engine twice, and both camshaft sprockets are lining up with the top of the cylinder head here, and our T marking is aligned with the casing there. So I'd say that we have everything set up properly. Our timing chain is now spaced properly between the 2 gears, and we're ready to start taking our measurements once again. Now, when putting this engine back together, the first and most important thing is making sure all the bolts that hold the camshaft in are torqued to specification and torqued in the sequence that they're supposed to be torqued in. You can see that Honda's actually gone here and labeled 1 through 10 on each one of these bolts. And I've gone here and I've already torqued these down. It was 9 foot-pounds, so that's already done on both camshafts. The next thing we want to do is clean up the sealing edge of the cylinder head where the rubber gasket mounts to. We'll use some brake parts cleaner and a rag to clean that all up. And when we're putting that valve cover back on, we'll put a little bit of sealant here in the corners where these half moons are. We want to put some sealant in there because the rubber gasket never fills in that perfectly, and you would get an oil leak if you didn't have some sort of sealer there. So I'm going to be using a sealant called Permatex No. 2. It's a non-hardening gasket sealer, and it'll work perfectly for filling in all the little imperfections in the aluminum and the rubber gasket. Put the air box back on top of the carburetors, we have to sync up the carburetors with one of these. This is a carburetor balancing tool, and You have to do this anytime you adjust the valves because now you have each cylinder taking in potentially more air than it did before, and you have to make sure those throttle bodies are now synced up with one another. So let's just really quick look at what it takes to hook up one of these tools. So this tool is called the Carburetor 2 synchronizer, and I think it costs a little over $100, maybe $120. Definitely worthwhile buying one of these if you do a lot of work to your own bike. So it consists of course, this little graph thing that has these little bars that go based on the volume that's being pulled through each carburetor. They move up and down based on the vacuum that's going through each carburetor. And then it comes with all of these silicone hoses which plug into ports on the backside of the carburetors through these little screw-on little nipples. So if you look at your carburetors, you actually have little screws that you unscrew and then you screw these into place. Okay, so where you hook these vacuum ports up to are on the backside of the carburetors, and you can see this one actually has just a little rubber cap on it. But the rest of the cylinders at the very bottom below the carburetor, you can see that they have these little Allen head type screws right back here. And again, there's 3 of those Allen head screws and then just one of these little rubber cappers. And you just take those screws out and then you thread those brass nipples into there. Then you hook up your silicone hoses and then you have the tool completely set up. Now you want to match up the hose that's coming off of cylinder 1 to the cylinder 1 here on the carb tune, and then just go down the line in that same manner. And then you want to mount this to somewhere where it can easily be seen and won't move on you while you're trying to do the adjustments. Now to balance the carburetors, we'll be using an adjustment screw between the 1 and 2 carburetors, and then between the 3 and 4 carburetors. And once those pairs of carburetors are balanced together, then we will adjust the 2 pairs together through this center screw. So the way you'll know the carburetors are starting to balance out are by looking at the carb tune tool itself. You'll see these silver bars come up, and you want to make sure they're equalized within a couple notches of each other. So again, you do this with the motorcycle on, so that's the next step. There is, of course, one step I've forgotten that we need to do before we even try to start this motorcycle, and is to hook up an external fuel source. So I've put this mini gas tank together out of a Gatorade bottle and a couple of sealing washers and a hose fitting that I got at the local hardware store, some fuel hose, and I even put a isolating fuel cutoff valve in the middle of this. I built this thing for about $10 all in. It's definitely gonna save you a lot of hassle instead of trying to use the actual gas tank of the motorcycle hovering above this whole assembly while you're trying to balance the carburetors. Technically that's possible, but it's a huge pain in the butt. So I recommend just putting something together like this because it'll save you a lot of time and hassle. All right, so that is our external fuel tank contraption set up. You can see I've just hung it from a workshop light here, and again, you just want a gravity to feed it into your fuel filter down there. I've turned the fuel on, so now we can start the engine up and get our carburetors adjusted. All right, with the carburetors now balanced, it now runs pretty well across the graph. It's within reason on the graph, so everything seems good to go. Let's take all this stuff back off of there and get the air box back on here. All right, so everything is now put back together. Let's start her up and see how she sounds. Alright, so it runs pretty well. I'd say that's a wrap. Now, if you're going to be going in and doing this to your own bike, make sure you get this factory service manual specific for your bike, because maybe some of the steps you've seen with this CBR won't fully apply to your bike, especially when it comes down to the valve clearance specifications. Those will definitely be different from bike to bike. But overall, the whole concept, the whole process is going to be very similar. It does take a bit of time. If I hadn't have done all the video to this, it definitely would have taken me a full day, just because you want to make sure everything's clean and goes back together well, because you don't want to be doing the same job twice. This bike's good to go for another, I think, 16,000 miles is what Honda specifies for this bike, so that's good to hear. Thanks a lot for watching, and we'll see you guys again next time.